She died holding my hand. 3 days later, I learned what abandonment truly meant. Not from her, not from fate, but from someone of my own blood. My brother, the same one who for years ignored every tear, every sleepless night, every medical emergency I faced alone. The same one who never answered a call when Mom lost her way and screamed my name, believing she was trapped in her childhood. That man, that being who shared a roof with me when we were children, was the one who looked me in the eyes and said without hesitation, "You have no place at our mother's burial." My heart pounded like a broken drum in my chest. My skin burned. My throat was dry, unable to utter a word. I had endured years of physical, emotional, and psychological wear and tear. I had watched my mother's body slowly deteriorate while her mind spiraled into a maze with no way out. I was the one who fed her when she stopped knowing how to swallow. I was the one who sang her lullabies to soothe her night terrors. I was the one who learned to read her eyes when she could no longer speak. And now, after all that, I had no right to be present when everyone else feigned mourning. The flowers on the coffin were white, but the air smelled of betrayal. I saw cousins, friends, and neighbors who hadn't set foot in our house for years arrive. They all greeted each other, cried, and hugged each other in hypocritical whispers. None of them knew what it was like to clean a grown woman 5 times a night because her bladder no longer responded. None of them knew what it was like to see her tremble with fear from voices only she could hear. No one, absolutely no one, knew what it was like to love her when she no longer even knew who I was. But there they were, all well-dressed, wearing dark glasses, touching her coffin as if they'd shared her last breath. And I, on the other side of the door, alone, sweating, empty-handed, because they wouldn't even let me leave her the rosary she kept under her pillow, the same one she clutched when she was afraid, the same one she once handed me with her trembling fingers and said, "Daughter, if one day I can no longer speak, this will be my voice." That day, at the wake, they took even that away from me. I remember the ground shaking beneath my feet when the guard stopped me. "Ma'am, you're not on the list." List. As if mourning a mother required approval. I showed her my ID, told her my name, told her I lived with her. I told her I was the one who found her cold body that morning, that I called the ambulance, that I prepared her favorite dress to put in the coffin. None of it mattered. My brother's voice sounded from inside the temple, sharp as a rusty knife. "Don't let her come in. She doesn't belong here." It was at that exact moment that I understood that there are griefs crueler than death. I didn't cry at that instant. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I just felt something shatter inside me with a dull crunch, like a china plate falling soundlessly to the floor. The same china we ate from when we were children. The same china my mother washed with care, as if each plate represented a piece of dignity in the midst of poverty. I sat on the curb, my feet still inside my old shoes. I didn't want to untie my laces. I didn't want to let go of anything else. I'd already lost so much. I spent the next few minutes remembering. I couldn't help it. The image of my mother saying she wanted a simple goodbye, no expensive flowers, no fake tears. She whispered it to me one afternoon when she was more lucid than usual. She held my hand tightly and said, "If anything happens to me, don't let me be surrounded by people who didn't want me alive." And yet there they were, everyone, clapping, singing, crying. And I was outside, under the sun that burned my back, listening from a distance. Every note of Amazing Grace sounded like a mockery. That was their favorite song. And instead of comforting me, it tore me apart. Because I wasn't inside. I couldn't be. I'd been erased. I'd been emotionally disowned, as if caring had no weight, as if sacrifice had no voice. That was the beginning of my true mourning. Not the day Mom died, not the day I saw her for the last time, but that exact moment when I discovered that love isn't enough. That for many people, love is only worth it if it's accompanied by titles, positions, and family hierarchies. And I, no matter how much I gave my all, never had an official place. I watched as they closed the coffin without me being able to kiss his forehead for the last time. And I understood that the most painful goodbyes are those that happen in silence, from the sidewalk, while the world continues to turn as if nothing had happened. But something did happen. Something broke inside me forever, because that scene, that injustice, that absolute contempt remained etched in my soul like an invisible scar. From that moment on, I was no longer just the woman who cared for her mother until her last breath. Now I was the woman who had been expelled from the only moment that belonged to her, the only ritual that could worthily close a story of love and pain. The wake ended. The flowers went to the cemetery. People returned to their homes. And I was still there, with my back against the brick wall of the church, my eyes dry, my mouth bitter, my heart frozen. I got up alone. I walked home alone. And when I got there, I saw the empty wheelchair, the bottle of medication on the table, my mother's favorite blouse still hanging on the clothesline. Everything smelled like her. Everything screamed her name. But she was gone. And I wasn't there either, because from that day on, I stopped being the same. My name is Helen Grace Thompson. I am 54 years old and live in a modest house south of Mobile, Alabama. Mornings here smell of freshly brewed coffee and Gulf humidity. My neighbors know me as the quiet lady who always sweeps the porch at 7 o'clock. Some think I'm a retired teacher. Others think I'm a nurse. And they're not entirely wrong. I was a nurse for over 20 years, until I stopped being one, not by choice, but because my mother needed me more than I could support myself. I had a light blue lab coat that I loved to work in. It was always clean, with pockets full of pens and small packets of cookies that I saved for my sweetest patients. I liked sitting with the elderly in the nursing home where I worked, listening to their stories, holding their hands, and telling them they weren't alone. Many told me I had a calling, that it wasn't common to see someone care with such tenderness. I often smiled, but inside I thought that, perhaps, I was trying to give to others what I never received. Since I was a child, I learned not to expect too much from anyone. I was raised amid silence and absence, in temporary housing, with people who offered shelter but no affection. I didn't have birthdays with balloons or bedtime stories. I learned to make my own food at 7 and to comfort myself when I cried, but I never complained. On the contrary, I grew up with a silent strength, with a patience that no one taught me, but that was born from abandonment. And perhaps that's why I became a nurse, because caring for others made me feel useful, necessary, part of something. When my mother came back into my life, I was 18. She showed up in an old coat with tired eyes and empty hands. She didn't bring gifts or promises. She only brought regret. She told me she wanted to get to know me, that she'd made mistakes, that there wasn't a day she didn't think about me. I didn't say anything at first. I watched her from afar, like you watch a stranger who suddenly claims to be part of your story. So much time had passed. I was already a woman, but inside me, there was still that little girl who fell asleep cuddled in one of her sweaters, waiting for her to come back. I forgave her, not because she deserved it. I forgave her because I needed to, because the resentment couldn't fit in my tired chest, because I felt that if I didn't give her a second chance, I was denying it to myself. From then on, we began seeing each other occasionally. At first, once a month, then every week. We shared lunches, walks in the park, late-night calls in which she told me about her life, her work as a domestic worker, her loneliness. And little by little, without realizing it, I was rebuilding that broken bond. She wasn't perfect. She was still absent, forgetful, and brusque. But at least she was there. When I learned of her diagnosis, I felt like the world stopped for a few seconds. Alzheimer's. The word weighed more than any other. It wasn't just a disease. It was the promise of a long, slow, and painful goodbye. It was like watching a candle slowly burn down, unable to extinguish it or speed it up. The doctor was clear. The deterioration would be progressive. There would be good days and days when I wouldn't even know where I was. He looked at me and asked if there was anyone else who could help. I said no. Although I had a brother, Robert, he had lived in another state for years and rarely called. I decided to quit my job. It wasn't an easy decision. It was my livelihood, my identity, my routine. But I knew she wouldn't survive alone. and I couldn't abandon her again. I felt like I had a debt I couldn't pay with money. So I packed my life into 3 boxes, rented my apartment, and moved in with her. I didn't do it out of obligation. I did it out of love. For that love we never had in my childhood, but that now, between diapers and spoonfuls of soup, we were trying to build. Our home became a kind of makeshift care center. I had a notebook where I wrote down everything. What time she ate, when she took her medicine, how many times she got confused. I became adept at reading her gestures, at anticipating her crises. If she blinked more than usual, I knew something wasn't right. If she hummed the same song over and over, I understood that she felt safe. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would sit up in bed and ask for her mother. I would go over, stroke her hair, and tell her everything was okay, that she was safe. Sometimes she mistook me for a nurse. Other times she called me by the name of her deceased sister. But when she called me daughter, even once a month, my heart would light up like a new candle. My routine with her was tough, but full of small miracles. Every smile she had was a gift. Every accident-free day was a victory. There were days when she hugged me for no reason. Days when she asked me to read the Bible to her. Days when she asked me if I had children. I told her no, I was never married. She would grimace and say, "Well, you should. You'd be a good mother." And I would swallow hard, because I knew it was too late for many things. My friends disappeared. Some grew tired of inviting me out. Others didn't know how to deal with my new life. But I didn't complain. I found companionship in the sounds of the house, in the ticking of the clock, the whirring of the refrigerator, the creaking of wood underfoot. I clung to the small pleasures: a cup of tea at the end of the day, an old movie on TV, a soft blanket in the winter, and above all, her. Watching her sleep, I wondered how someone so fragile had endured so much, how she had survived grueling work, a system that treated her as invisible, a life of deprivation. And then I understood that in some way, that same strength lived within me, that I was her reflection, that even though she hadn't told me so often, there was also love in her silence. But there was something else that accompanied me every day, a feeling, an internal murmur that reminded me that nothing lasted forever, that at some point, I would have to face goodbye. I didn't know when or how. I only knew it was near, and that when it came, I would have to be strong. Stronger than ever, because deep down, I had already lost my mother many times. Every time she forgot my name, every time she asked me to come home when we were already home, every time she freaked out at her own reflection in the mirror. That's how I lived for almost 6 years, between invisible goodbyes and tender moments. I learned to live with a full heart and empty arms. And although I never said it out loud, every night I went to sleep hoping the next day would be a good one. One of those days when she smiled at me when I woke up and said, "Good morning, my little girl." Because in those small words, I found meaning in everything. My childhood wasn't a safe place. It was more like a wasteland where the only thing that grew was silence. For as long as I can remember, I always knew something was missing. I didn't put it into words, but I felt it in my chest every time I saw other girls hug their mothers at the school gate. I had no one to run to when my knees scraped. There was no voice to lull me when I had a fever. My mother left me when I was barely 5. I remember all too clearly the sound of the door closing and the smell of mothballs that lingered on her coat as she walked away. She said she had to work, that it was the best thing for me, that where she was going couldn't take me. She said she'd be back soon, but soon turned into months, then years, and then absolute silence. She left me at the house of a distant aunt who barely knew my name, a rigid woman who saw life as an obligation. There were never hugs, games, or songs, only orders, duties, and glances that weighed like stones. I slept on a mattress on the floor, ate when there was something left, and I learned not to disturb anyone, because in that house, affection was a luxury reserved for others. I remember once drawing a portrait of my mother in school. I did it with broken crayons, painting her long hair and red lips. I taped it to the wall of my room, right above the mattress. My aunt tore it down and threw it in the trash without saying a word. That night I cried quietly. I covered my mouth with my pillow so no one would hear. It was at that moment, perhaps, that I understood that my pain had no space, that I had to keep it deep inside if I wanted to survive. There was never a letter, never a call, not even a text. I used to look out the window every time I heard a car engine. I imagined she'd come down with flowers, that she'd run up to me and scoop me up, saying she'd missed me. But the cars kept going. So did the years. I became a serious girl, a woman of few words. A girl who learned to love in secret, to imagine her own families in her head, to draw houses where the kitchen always smelled of freshly baked bread and the table had chairs for everyone. School was my refuge. There, I lost myself in books, in stories that spoke of mothers who defended their daughters from monsters, of grandmothers who wove magic blankets, of homes where love was as commonplace as water. I clung to those stories with the strength of a drowning man. Sometimes I volunteered to help the teachers after school just to stay a little longer. One of them, Miss Wilkins, was the first person to ask me if I was lonely. I didn't know how to respond. I just nodded, my eyes filling with tears. She hugged me, and that simple gesture was more maternal than anything I'd ever received before. The years passed, and with them, the hope of seeing my mother again faded like a candle consumed by the wind. But at 18, something happened I never imagined. I received a letter, a yellowed piece of paper with shaky handwriting that said, "Helen, I am your mother. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I would like to see you. I'm in Mobile. I work at a laundry. I don't know if you remember me. If you hate me, I just wanted to see you one more time." The letter trembled in my hands. I read those words over and over again. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to tear it up, burn it, throw it in the river. But another part, that broken part that was still waiting for a hug, wanted to run to her. The decision wasn't easy. I spent days thinking. I spoke to no one. I kept the letter in the drawer next to my childhood photos, the few I had. Finally, one Saturday afternoon, I took the bus downtown and got off in front of the laundromat she had mentioned. She was there, thinner than I remembered. Her gray hair was tied back in a bun, her hands covered in detergent. When she saw me, her body stopped. It was as if time froze between us. I walked toward her without saying a word. She dropped a rag she was folding and said, "Helen, you've grown so much." Her voice was a whisper filled with guilt. I didn't know what to do, whether to hug her, hit her, or ask her why. But I did nothing. I stayed still. She cried like a lost child, and I let her. Not out of pity, but because in that moment I understood that I didn't have all the answers, that not everything could be explained. That was the beginning of a complicated reconciliation. We saw each other several times afterward, sometimes in cafes, other times in the park. She told me parts of her story. She said she'd worked in family homes, that she'd been abused, that she'd been afraid, that she didn't know how to raise me, that her life was a succession of mistakes. I never heard her justify herself. She only confessed, as if speaking to God. I listened. I didn't forgive her immediately, but I didn't reject her either. There was something in her gaze that told me all was not lost, that maybe, with time, we could build something new. We began spending Sundays together. We cooked together, did a little shopping at the market, watched old movies. She told me about my grandmother, how she loved to sing while she cooked. She gave me a bracelet that she said had been hers, a cheap, fancy piece of jewelry, but one that I treasured as if it were gold. Sometimes she'd call me at night just to find out if I'd gotten home safely. Other times, she'd leave me messages on my answering machine with songs she remembered from my childhood. She'd ask me if I had a boyfriend, if I was thinking of having children. I'd laugh. I told her I had a lot of things to sort out first. And she'd tell me I'd already wasted too much time to not experience love, too. That's how, little by little, my mother returned to my life. Not as a heroine, not as someone perfect, but as a broken woman trying to mend the pieces with fine thread. And although I had wounds too, I began to see in her something more than an absent figure. I began to see a real woman, human, fragile. And perhaps that's why, when her memory began to fail years later, I was the first to notice. The first time she forgot my name, it was like an invisible slap in the face. We were watching television. I asked if she wanted more tea. She looked at me with empty eyes and said, "Who are you?" I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, but it wasn't. She really didn't know. I froze, the cup trembling in my hands. That night, I cried silently, the way I had as a child, but this time, not out of abandonment, but out of fear, because I realized I was about to lose her for the second time. Only this time, I was going to stay. I was going to take care of her, because even if she forgot me, I was never going to forget her. When the doctor said the word Alzheimer's, I felt as if the world had silently collapsed. It was as if everything around me had shut down, but from within, there were no explosions, no screams, no immediate tears, just that silent emptiness that appears when you realize something has broken and can no longer be repaired. Mom looked at me from the stretcher, unable to understand what was happening, and I could only hold her hand tightly, as if that were enough to keep her in the present. The first time I noticed something wasn't right was one ordinary afternoon. We were cooking. I handed her the salt, and she held it up in the air, as if she didn't know what to do with it. After an awkward silence, she asked me what that was in my hand. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her gaze was blank, confused, as if the world I knew had twisted without warning. It wasn't ordinary forgetfulness. It wasn't distraction. It was something deeper, a disconnection. At first, they were small signs. She forgot the names of the streets we walked every day. She kept the bread in the freezer. She put sugar in her rice. She called me by names I didn't know. Sometimes she called me Julia. Other times, Rosa. I gently corrected her, thinking maybe she was tired. But deep down, a part of me already knew, because a daughter learns to read her mother's silences long before her words. We went to 3 different doctors. One said it was stress. Another said it was age. But none of them looked Mom in the eye. None of them saw her skin tremble when she couldn't remember how to get home from the market. It wasn't until the 4th appointment, with a patient and warm geriatrician, that the diagnosis was made: early-stage Alzheimer's. And even though he said it softly, I felt like he was shouting it in my ear. It was official. I was going to lose my mother for the second time, and this time, slowly, piece by piece. The following days were a blur. I woke up as if on automatic. I went to work. I came back. I found her sitting on the couch, staring at the off television. Sometimes she cried for no reason, or she laughed at things that weren't happening. Once I found her talking to herself in the bathroom. I asked her who she was talking to. She told me it was her mother, that she was there, next to the curtain. That day, I locked myself in the room and cried with a rage that burned inside me. Not for her, but for everything that was coming, for everything I would have to face. I talked to my brother. I told him the diagnosis. I asked him to come over, to talk to her, to hug her. He gave me evasive answers, that he had work, that he was far away, maybe at Christmas. But Christmas never came. Neither did he. Mom asked about him sometimes with a mixture of hope and sadness. I didn't know what to say. I just smiled at him and told him I was fine, that everything was fine. I made the hardest decision of my life. I quit my job, my stability, my routine, my salary, my independence, because I knew I couldn't leave her alone. Because no nursing home, no nurse, no scheduled time was going to give her the kind of love I could. Love with patience, with tenderness, with history. I became her shadow, at her feet, in her memories. The transformation was complete. I turned the guest room into a sort of makeshift clinic. I bought bed rails. I labeled the drawers with drawings and big words. I organized pillboxes by schedule. I installed cameras in the corners of the hallway in case she got lost during the night. I painted the walls in warm colors. I put away all the sharp objects. I did it all alone, without help, without advice, only with the intuition of someone who cares because they love, not because they have to. The first few months were a mix of tenderness and terror. There were days when she was lucid. She called me by name. She told me stories from the past. She asked if I wanted to cook together. I clung to those moments like diamonds, because I knew they were few and far between, that with each passing day another would be lost. And then there were the other days, the days of screaming, the days of panic, the days of running around the house looking for a mother who no longer existed. One night I found her in the garden, barefoot, in the rain. She was soaked, her robe open, staring up at the sky as if waiting for a sign. I hugged her. I wrapped her in a blanket. I told her everything was okay. She looked at me and asked who I was. And in that moment, I didn't feel pain. I felt emptiness, because her voice was the same, her smell was the same, but her eyes were in another world. I learned things I never thought I'd learn: how to control anxiety attacks without using sedatives, how to redirect a conversation when she started talking to someone who wasn't there, how to bathe her without embarrassing her, how to cut her food into small pieces because she was no longer well coordinated. Every day was a new lesson, a new test, a new grief. I started documenting everything, not out of morbid curiosity, but because I felt like if I didn't write it down, I'd go crazy. I had a notebook in the kitchen where I wrote everything down. How many times she woke up during the night, how many times she said my name, how many times she asked me to take her home when we were already home. Sometimes I also wrote down what I felt, my frustration, my exhaustion, my love, that love that hurt because it wasn't reciprocated like before. Because loving someone who no longer remembers you is an act of faith. My routine changed completely. I woke up at 6 in the morning. I made her oatmeal with honey. I gave her her medicine. I dressed her. I sat her in front of the window so the sun would caress her face. Then I read aloud to her. Sometimes the Bible, other times, old stories. She fell asleep on the couch while I washed the dishes. And so the days passed, one after the other, like waves crashing relentlessly against the same rock. There were nights when I sat on the bathroom floor and cried. I cried silently, so as not to scare her. I cried for myself, for her, for everything that wasn't, for everything that was too late. But the next day I would get up, I would wash my face, and I would start all over again, because I knew that as long as she breathed, as long as her body was on this earth, I would still be there. Because taking care of her wasn't an obligation. It was a way of healing, and also of telling her without words that I forgave her, even though she could no longer hear me, even though she no longer knew who I was, even though my name was just a strange sound in her mind. I was still there, because in that small, fragile body, the woman who gave me life still lived, and even though the illness tried to erase her, I was going to fight for every piece of her that remained, even though it cost me everything. Because truly loving, sometimes, means holding on to what's falling apart, even though it hurts, even though it's tiring, even though no one sees. There came a moment when I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. I was no longer the same woman who once dreamed of traveling the world as a volunteer nurse. I was no longer the young woman who saved recipe clippings to cook for her imaginary children. Now, I was someone else. I had deep, dark circles under my eyes, my fingers crooked from squeezing the sponge to wash the dishes, my knees marked from spending so many early mornings kneeling beside my mother's bed, praying she wouldn't drown in her own lost words. I no longer dressed for myself. I didn't style my hair. I didn't go for walks for pleasure. My world shrank to a 5-meter radius. Kitchen, bathroom, living room, bedroom. That was my universe. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was the silence. That dry, thick silence that settled between us when Mom went for hours without speaking, or when she uttered meaningless phrases that made me understand she was no longer there. Like when she asked me to find her sister Lydia to tell her that Dad hadn't come home from work. I didn't know how to respond. Her sister Lydia had died more than 40 years ago, and her father, well, he was never really there. Instead of correcting her, I sat beside her and pretended we were searching for a solution together. Because I learned that sometimes, love also means lying tenderly. I sacrificed much more than I ever imagined. I sold my car to pay for an orthopedic bed. I went into debt to buy medications that weren't covered by insurance. I spent the only rings I had to repair the water heater. In the middle of winter, Mom complained of being cold even though she was wrapped in 3 blankets. Her skin turned purple if the temperature dropped even a couple of degrees. And I, despite my exhaustion, looked for solutions. I called neighbors. I collected pennies. I recycled old things. Anything so she wouldn't suffer. I never slept more than 3 hours at a time. Every time I heard a noise, I woke up with my heart in my throat. Once I found her trying to leave through the front door at 3 in the morning. She was holding a bag of stale bread and said she was going to the market. I asked her what she was looking for. She replied that she needed to buy flowers for her mother's birthday. That night, I couldn't go back to sleep. I sat in front of the door with a chair and a thermos of coffee. I watched every shadow until dawn. On an emotional level, it was like living in a minefield. I never knew which version of Mom I'd wake up to. Sometimes she was sweet, talkative, nostalgic. She'd hold my hand and tell me I was her blessing, that she didn't know what she would have done without me. In those moments, my heart filled with light. But other times she was harsh, distant, aggressive. She called me a thief, asked me to leave her house, to stay away. Once she threw a glass of water in my face, not out of malice, out of fear, because she didn't recognize me, because in her mind, I was an intruder. Those wounds don't bleed, but they hurt like they do. Because there's nothing more heartbreaking than being rejected by the person you love when you know it's not their fault. And yet, there I was, not raising my voice, not responding in anger, just swallowing the pain. Sometimes I locked myself in the bathroom and bit a towel to keep from screaming. And when I managed to calm down, I came out with a rehearsed smile and a hot cup of tea. Because that's what carers do. They break in silence and rebuild in secret. My hands began to crack. My hair fell out in clumps. My back creaked every time I bent over. But there was no time for doctors or massages or luxuries. Everything I was, everything I had, everything I knew was at her service. I ceased to exist as an individual. I became an extension of her need. And though it sounds cruel, there were days when I wished it would all end. Not because I didn't love her, but because I was exhausted, empty, invisible. But those thoughts didn't last long. Just seeing her sleeping, her face relaxed and her eyelids trembling, was enough to bring tears to my eyes. Because in that wrinkled face, my mother was still there. Even if her mind wandered, even if her memory erased me, her body was still there. And I knew that as long as I breathed, I had a mission. There was one day in particular I can't forget. She had a fever, a high one. Her skin burned to the touch. She was breathing heavily. I took her temperature, 40 degrees. I called emergency services, but they told me I'd have to wait, that the hospitals were overwhelmed. I sat beside her, holding a wet cloth, trying to bring her fever down. She looked at me with red eyes and yelled nonsense. She said her soul hurt, that she was being punished, that the water was dirty, that someone stole her favorite dress. The fever was making her delirious. She cried, screamed, and begged for help. I tried to calm her, but I couldn't. I felt like I was losing her, that she was leaving me, that this was the end. I played her a song her mother used to sing, something simple, with a guitar and a soft voice. I put it in her ear. At first, she didn't react. Then, very slowly, she began to hum. Her lips were dry, her eyes lost, but she hummed. I clung to that sound like it was a thread keeping her grounded, as if every note would bring her back. And somehow it did. The fever subsided with dawn. Little by little. I didn't sleep at all. I just looked at her. I touched her. I checked that she was still alive. When she opened her eyes, she said thank you in a barely audible voice. That word was worth more than all the diplomas, all the recognitions, all the praise I'd ever received in my life. Because it wasn't just a thank you. It was a validation. It was her soul speaking to me, even if it was just for a second. Those moments were my fuel, my reason, my faith. Because caring for someone who fades away before your eyes is a form of love that transcends ego, time, and reward. It's loving knowing you may never receive anything in return, and yet, doing it. because it's the right thing to do, because you feel it, because that's how you were raised, or because, as in my case, that's how you decided to break the cycle of abandonment. As time passed, my body began to get used to the routine of sacrifice. My feet didn't hurt so much anymore. I no longer cried every night. I no longer agonized over every mistake I made. I began to enjoy the small achievements, that he ate well, that he slept peacefully, that he called me by name even once a month. I learned to live in the present, to celebrate the moments, to value the minutes. And I also learned to accept, to let go of the illusion that one day everything would be the same again, because that before no longer existed, because life sometimes doesn't give second chances. It only gives moments, fragile, fleeting moments that must be embraced with all your heart. That's how I began to understand that my story wasn't just that of a daughter taking care of her mother. It was the story of a woman who chose to love even when she was no longer recognized, who chose to stay when everyone else left, who chose to build dignity amidst ruin, and who, despite the pain, still had the strength to smile. Because love, that love that is given unconditionally, is the only medicine that never runs out. What hurt me most wasn't watching Mom deteriorate day after day. What hurt me most was watching the world keep turning, not stopping for a second for her. People kept hurrying along the sidewalk. Stores opened their doors as if nothing had happened. Neighbors laughed in their yards, watering their plants, talking about trivial things. No one suspected that inside our house there was a woman slowly slipping into oblivion. A woman who had once been young, strong, brave. A woman who now couldn't even remember how to tie her shoelaces. The isolation was deeper than I imagined. There were entire mornings we would spend without uttering a single word. Not out of anger, but because she no longer had much to say, and I didn't know which words to use that wouldn't hurt. I became her interpreter to the world, her voice, her memory, her bridge to reality. I went to her doctor's appointments with a folder full of notes. I recorded her behaviors, her habits, her falls. I showed videos of her episodes so the doctors could better understand what she was going through. They nodded with neutral expressions. They recommended exercises. They repeated phrases like, "It's part of the process," or "You must be patient." No one told me how to support myself emotionally. No one asked if I was eating well, if I was sleeping, if I still remembered what it was like to live without fear. My brother was still absent. Robert. His name was beginning to provoke in me a kind of rage I'd never heard before. He called once every 3 months, always in the same forced tone of politeness. He asked how Mom was. I told her I was fine, even if it was a lie. He asked if I needed anything. I told him no, even though I wanted to shout that I did, that I needed help, rest, a break. But I didn't, because I knew there was no real concern on the other end of the line. Just a moral obligation fulfilled in 3 minutes. One afternoon, Mom had a major meltdown. She locked herself in the bathroom and started screaming that someone was following her. She said they were trying to kill her, that she had to hide. She banged on the door with a force she didn't know she still had. I tried to calm her from the outside. I told her it was me, that she was safe, that no one was going to hurt her, but she didn't listen. In her mind, I was part of the danger. I called 911, my voice shaking. Paramedics came. They sedated her. They took her to the hospital. And there, in front of them, I had to answer all the questions as if I were responsible for everything, as if caring for someone wasn't breaking me down inside. I sat in the waiting room for 5 hours. I had no one to call. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just stared at the blank wall in front of me and breathed. Sometimes crying isn't soothing. Sometimes it only exhausts. And that night, I didn't even have the energy to cry. When they finally let me see her, she was asleep. Her lips were dry, her hands strapped to the table for safety, her body covered with a thin sheet. I leaned in close, stroked her hair, and whispered that it was all over now, that she was okay, that I was still there. I didn't know if she heard me, but I needed to say it, because it was the only truth I had left. After that episode, her condition worsened. She walked with difficulty. She ate little. She slept more than usual. Her skin became paler. Her hands trembled even when it wasn't cold. She began to have episodes of incontinence. I had to bathe her with warm sponges, change her diapers, moisturize her skin with creams to prevent sores. I did it all with the same care a mother would a newborn. Because indeed, that's what she had become. A fragile child trapped in the body of an old woman. And I was now all she needed to keep breathing. On one of the few days when she seemed conscious, she took my hand and said a phrase that is forever etched in my memory. She looked me in the eyes with a sudden and painful lucidity and said, "Forgive me for leaving you alone." I didn't know how to respond. I hugged her. I cried. I felt like that phrase was like a key that opened all the closed doors of my childhood. I didn't need any more explanations. I didn't need excuses. That forgiveness, spoken with the voice of a dying mother, was more powerful than 1,000 justifications. The following days were a kind of silent farewell. Mom no longer spoke. She only looked at me sometimes. Other times, not even that. I sat by her bed and read books aloud to her. Books she'd loved when she was young. I sang softly to her. I moistened her lips with gauze. I told her stories from when I was a child. I invented happy anecdotes. I told her about a past we didn't have, but that I longed for so much it almost seemed real. Sometimes I told her that Dad was fine, that her sister was coming to visit, that everything was fine. Sweet lies for a soul that only needed peace. One night, as I held her hand, I noticed her breathing was different, slower, more fragile. I leaned toward her face. I listened to the most absolute silence. That silence you only hear once in a lifetime. The exact moment when someone is no longer there. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I just stood there, hugging her warm body, feeling life slowly leave her, like the last wisp of smoke from a candle that goes out without warning. I called the funeral home. They arrived with their soft voices, their hands trained in the ritual of death. They asked me questions. They handed me papers. They offered me packages. Everything was so impersonal, so technical, so cold. I wanted to scream that this wasn't just another client, that this woman had been my mother, that I had given everything for her, that I had cared for her like a fragile jewel in the middle of an earthquake. But I didn't say anything. I just signed what they asked me to, and I asked them, please, to treat her with respect. That night, I slept for the first time in a long time. A deep sleep. No startles, no fears, no crying. I woke up at dawn to find the room silent. The kind of silence that no longer scares you. The kind of silence that tells you the cycle has come full circle, that you've given it your all, that nothing remains unfinished. But I didn't know that the most painful part was yet to come. Because sometimes, pain doesn't come only with loss. Sometimes the real blow comes from those who should hold you up and instead push you into the abyss. And it was in that abyss that I discovered that even in death, abandonment takes 1,000 forms, and that there are betrayals that don't heal, not even with time. The morning of the funeral dawned gray, not like those poetic grays painted in books, but a dirty, harsh, dense gray, as if the sky knew what was going to happen and refused to look. I got up early even though I hadn't slept much. The sleep I'd felt the night before was more physical than real. It was as if my body, exhausted, had given up. But my mind, my soul, were still suspended in that dimension where pain is so present, it becomes almost solid. I dressed in the best outfit I had, a simple, unadorned black dress, the same one I'd once worn to a coworker's graduation. I combed my hair carefully. I put on a pair of small pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother, not for luxury, for symbolism, for presence. It was her farewell, and she deserved for me to stand, dignified, whole, even if I was torn apart inside. When I arrived at the funeral home, something was already weighing on my stomach. It wasn't intuition, it was knowledge, a bitter certainty that had been brewing for days. I knew Robert would show up. I knew he would, with his pressed suit, his model son face, and that tone of voice he used when he wanted to manipulate others with false politeness. And so it was. I saw him from afar, His impeccable figure, his perfectly combed hair, his polished shoes. He walked among the people as if he were the host of an elegant reception. He greeted people politely. He approached the flowers. He shook hands with the funeral home employees. He smiled. I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. Not from nerves, from rage, from helplessness, from injustice. Because that man, who hadn't appeared in years, who hadn't held Mom's hand even one night during her worst delusions, was now the center of attention. People surrounded him, hugged him, told him they were sorry. And they looked at me as if I were part of the furniture, as if I were just a shadow in that scene. When I tried to approach the coffin, I was intercepted by a woman I didn't know. She asked me my name in a questioning tone. I told her. She looked me up and down and curtly told me to wait my turn. I didn't know what to say. I walked away. I took a deep breath. I sat in a corner. I watched the scene from afar. I saw them place Mom's portrait on an ornate table. I saw them light candles. They placed an open Bible in the center. And still, no one looked at me. No one came closer. No one said, "Come, you were there." Minutes later, Robert approached me. His gaze was tense, hard, and restrained. He sat down next to me as if every inch of distance weighed on him. He looked me in the eyes and said what I never thought I'd hear. "Helen, this isn't your place." My stomach tightened as if I'd been punched. I didn't understand, or I didn't want to understand. I thought it was a misunderstanding. I asked him what he meant by that. He repeated it more firmly, that I shouldn't be there, that Mom had left instructions, that she didn't want anyone at her wake who wasn't part of her real family. He used those words, real family. I didn't know how I didn't faint, how I didn't burst into tears in front of everyone, how my body kept breathing. I stood up without responding. I walked toward the door like a ghost, as if my feet no longer belonged to me. People stared at me without understanding. Some whispered. Others avoided my gaze. I felt like an intruder in my own story, as if the years of care, of sacrifice, of silent love had been erased with a mumbled phrase. I went out to the parking lot. I leaned against the wall. The air burned my lungs. Tears flowed without permission. My legs trembled. I wanted to run, to disappear, to forget, but I didn't. I stayed there, because even if they had taken away my physical place at that wake, no one could take away the story we had lived. No one could erase the sleepless nights, the whispered songs, the unread letters. No one could erase the fact that I was the one who held her when her body no longer responded, that I was the one who said goodbye with dignity, that I was the one who gave her back a bit of humanity when she could no longer even remember her own name. I called a friend, the only one who knew everything. I told her what had happened. She listened silently. Then she said something that left a lasting impression on me. Helen told me, "You don't need to be at that funeral to honor your mother. You honored her every day you cared for her, every tear you shed, every night you didn't sleep. That was your funeral. That process you lived through alone, in the privacy of your home. Don't let them take that away from you too." Her words gave me a calm I hadn't expected. I sat in the car. I closed my eyes. I imagined Mom in her favorite chair, with her blue blanket, looking out the window. I saw myself beside her, reading poems, stroking her hair, telling her everything was okay. And I understood that real love doesn't need witnesses, that true love is measured in actions, not ceremonies, that the value of a daughter isn't written in a church program, but on the worn skin of someone who cared for her without expecting anything in return. That day, while everyone gathered to talk about the woman she was, I allowed myself to cry for the woman no one knew, the one who was afraid at night, the one who forgot her words, the one who begged for forgiveness with her eyes, the one who one day, between confusion and tenderness, told me I was her angel. And that was enough. More than enough. Because that phrase, spoken in a whisper, was worth more than any tribute. Back home, I opened the notebook where I had recorded each stage of her illness. I wrote one last entry. Not for her. For me. I wrote, "You gave it your all, Helen. You owe me nothing." I closed the notebook. I put it in the wooden box she used for her sewing, and I sealed it, like a cycle is sealed, like a wound is healed, with care, with pain, with love. That day I understood that sometimes there is no justice, that sometimes there is no recognition, that sometimes the people to whom we give the most are those who value what they receive the least. But I also understood that what is done out of love is never lost, that it remains in the skin, in the memory, in the invisible, that even if the world doesn't see it, a daughter who cares with her soul leaves an eternal mark. And that mark, although silent, is more powerful than any word denied in front of a coffin. Returning home that day was like walking on the remains of a shipwreck. Every corner spoke of her. The marks on the sofa where she sat every afternoon, the jar of cream by the sink, her slippers, still lined up next to the bed, as if at any moment they might move on their own. Nothing made sense without her presence. The air was thick, laden with a silence that wasn't just absence, it was also injustice. The injustice of having been excluded not only from the final goodbye, but also from the narrative told about her. Because those who were never there were now the official authors of her story. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee in my hands. I didn't drink it. I just held it. It was as if this gesture of holding something warm anchored me to a minimal sense of normalcy. But nothing was normal. It was like standing in front of a broken mirror. Each fragment returned a different image of myself. The sacrificed daughter, the ignored woman, the invisible caregiver, and beneath it all, barely perceptible, the child still searching for a touch that never came. I turned on the radio without thinking. It played a song Mom used to hum while she was cooking. I brought my hands to my face, and for the first time since she died, I cried hard. Not like a suppressed wail, but like a soundless scream that rips from the depths of my soul. I cried for her, for myself, for the stolen years, for the unspoken words, for the hugs that would no longer exist. I cried until I felt something inside me empty, and in that emptiness, I found a new space. Not peace, not yet, but true peace. Because in the midst of all the emotional chaos, I began to see clearly. I realized I had lived for too long expecting something from others. Recognition, validation, a kind of invisible applause that never came. I had shaped my existence around duty, care, silent sacrifice. And now that all that was over, I felt identityless, as if I only knew how to exist through the needs of others. Who was I without them? What was left of me when there was no one left to care for? I had no answers. Just a house full of echoes and objects that no longer served any purpose. I decided to start there. I opened the closet and began to take out her clothes. One by one, with respect, with pain, with love. I folded them slowly, as if with each piece I could reconstruct a piece of her story. I kept a few, the most meaningful ones. Her floral blouse, the scarf she wore when she felt sick, her lavender-scented nightgown. I packed the rest to donate, because I understood that letting go isn't forgetting, it's making space to breathe. I came across her diary, one she never showed me. It was hidden among old books. I opened it with trembling hands. Her handwriting was clumsy, shaky, but there was her voice, her innermost thoughts, her doubts, her fears, and also her childhood memories, her moments of joy, her disappointments. On a page written in blue ink, I read something that broke my heart. It said, "I feel like a burden. Sometimes I see Helen so tired that I wonder if she'll ever forgive me for all this." I had to close the notebook. I couldn't go on. That sentence pierced me like an arrow, because I never told her she wasn't a burden, that every second I spent by her side was a choice of love, not an obligation. That yes, I got tired, I broke, I got lost, but I never blamed her. On the contrary, I took care of her because I loved her, because she gave me life, because despite everything, all I wanted was for her to feel safe, loved, protected, and now it was too late to tell her that. In the days that followed, I continued to discover small traces of her time in the world. A receipt kept with a dried flower, a handwritten prescription with crossouts and notes, a letter she never sent to her sister. Those tiny things became my treasure. Each object had a story. Every detail was a clue to who she was beyond her illness, beyond old age, beyond oblivion. And that reconnected me with something I thought I'd lost: tenderness. I began to write. I didn't know what purpose it served. I just felt the need to put into words everything I was feeling. I filled pages with memories, with emotions, with questions, not to publish, not to share, just to survive. Because I understood that writing was a way to talk to her, to continue that dialogue that the illness had stolen from us. And in that process, something inside me began to stir, like a seed that awakens after winter. One afternoon, while I was arranging photographs, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated to answer. Finally, I did. It was an older woman. She introduced herself as Clara. She said she had been a friend of my mother's during her youth, that she had heard about her death and needed to tell me something. She told me anecdotes I'd never heard before. She told me how my mother was a rebellious young woman, passionate about poetry, with a scandalous laugh that everyone remembered. She told me that they once ran away together to see a concert, that they danced in the rain, that they shared their first cigarette and their first broken heart. I hung up with tears in my eyes, not just because of what I heard, but because of what it meant. My mother had been many things before she was my mother. She'd had a life full of nuances, adventures, mistakes, and joys, and I only knew part of it. That call reminded me that we are all more than our later years, more than our illnesses, more than our difficult moments, and that love is also allowing the other to exist beyond what they were for us. That night, I opened her diary again, this time with less fear, with more desire to know her, and in each line, I found a new version of her, a version that brought me even closer, because the truth, however painful, always unites more than a lie. And so, little by little, I began to piece together a different story, not the story of abandonment or rejection or the funeral from which I was excluded, but the story of true love, of silent devotion, of bonds that don't need witnesses to be eternal. I learned that healing isn't forgetting, it's transforming, and that sometimes, to rebuild, you have to go through the dust, through the screaming, through the rage, but also through tenderness, through forgiveness, through the acceptance that some answers will never come, and that even so, we can continue, we can love again, we can be again. Because absence, when honored with truth, can also be the seed of something new, something more human, more real, more ours. For weeks on end, I couldn't leave the house, not out of fear of confronting others, but because of that inner feeling of being incomplete. It was as if every street I walked down, every face I met, reminded me how invisible I had been during the most important goodbye of my life. I walked through the neighborhood with the feeling that everyone knew, even if no one said anything, as if I wore an invisible sign hanging on my back that said, "She wasn't invited." People greeted me with a strange kindness, a mix of pity and caution, as if they didn't know whether to ask or just keep quiet. A neighbor came over with an apple pie. She told me she was so sorry about Mom. She had been a very strong woman. I smiled and thanked her, but deep down, I knew the pie was a way of clearing my guilt, because for the past few years, no one knocked on the door. No one offered help. No one stopped to see if we needed anything. Grief, when experienced alone, also has absent witnesses, and that hurts more than silence. I tried to go back to work, but I couldn't. I sat in front of the computer and the letters blurred. The reports, the emails, the urgent tasks. Everything seemed absurd. How could I worry about metrics when I could still feel the echo of her labored breathing? How could I pretend to be normal when every cell in my body screamed that I'd lost more than a mother? I'd lost an identity, a routine, a purpose, because my life for so long revolved around her. I received an invitation to a memorial service at the neighborhood church. They were paying tribute to several deceased members. I hesitated to attend. I didn't want to confront Robert. I didn't want to share the same air with him, but something inside me told me I should go. Not for him, for her. I dressed simply. I carried in my pocket a handkerchief that Mom used at her masses. Upon arriving, I saw familiar faces. Some avoided me, others hugged me awkwardly, but there was one look in particular that touched me, that of Mrs. Amelia, an older woman who had been my mother's companion during evening prayer. She came over, took my hand, and said in a firm voice, "Your mother spoke of you with a love you can't imagine." I felt a lump in my throat, because despite everything, the omissions, the forgetfulness, the illness, she still saw me as her daughter, not her caregiver, not her shadow, her daughter. And that, at that moment, was everything. During the ceremony, they named Mom among the deceased. They lit a candle for her. They sang a hymn. And for the first time since her death, I felt her soul had found a worthy place. Maybe it wasn't the funeral I deserved, but it was an act of love that I myself decided to live. A small act of justice in the midst of so much desolation. After the event, I returned home with a newfound calm. It wasn't happiness, not even peace. It was a sad but honest serenity. I sat in front of the portrait of Mom that I hung on the dining room wall. I spoke out loud to her. I told her how it had all been. I told her I missed her, that sometimes I got angry at her for leaving me with that burden alone, but that I understood, because life had hit her hard too. I told her that despite the pain, I would choose her again, always. I started cooking her recipes, not out of necessity, but out of memory. Preparing her lentil stew, following the same steps she taught me, became a kind of ritual. As I chopped the vegetables, I felt she was by my side, correcting me, laughing when I added too much salt. Every aroma in the kitchen was a bridge to her, a bridge that not everyone could see, but which was real to me. I began talking to other women who had also been caregivers, in support groups, on forums, on social media. I read stories identical to mine. Displaced daughters, ignored sisters, exhausted women who gave everything and were erased from the final decisions. I discovered that mine wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a silent pattern, of a culture that romanticizes caregiving but doesn't honor it, that expects women to give their all and then leaves them out of the final picture. That made me think about how many stories like mine are lost in oblivion. How many anonymous daughters, without recognition, without farewell, without emotional justice. I promised myself I wouldn't let mine go unnoticed. I began to write a more organized testimony, with dates, with emotions, with details. I didn't know if I would publish it, but I needed to leave a record. For me, for others, for her. One day I received a letter. It was handwritten. It was from Mom's cousin, a woman we lost touch with years ago. She told me she'd heard about everything that had happened and wanted me to know that she always acknowledged what I did, that she admired my dedication, that she'd known for a long time that Robert only showed up when there was a stake in his case, and that she regretted not having done more. That letter, in its humility, gave me back something I thought was lost, the certainty that the truth, even if it takes time, always finds its way out. I sat in front of the garden and looked at the flowers Mom cared for so much. I thought about how much she talked to her plants. She sang to them. She asked their permission before pruning them. She said they were living beings with souls. Now, every time I water one, I feel like I'm talking to her. And so, in every small, everyday gesture, I rebuild what was taken from us. Because real bonds aren't destroyed by exclusions. They are reaffirmed in intimate acts, in living memory, in the love that doesn't need permission to exist. One afternoon, while organizing old papers I'd been avoiding for weeks, I found a cream-colored envelope with no return address or stamp. It was wrinkled but sealed with an old adhesive, as if someone had prepared it years ago to be delivered only when the time was right. I opened it leisurely with trembling fingers, as if I already knew deep down that what I was about to read would change everything. Inside was a letter written in my mother's handwriting. I recognized its soft, uncertain, yet still clear handwriting. The date in the top corner startled me. It was from almost 6 years ago, before Alzheimer's began to steal her words, Before the days began to repeat themselves like blurred echoes, I began to read, and as the lines progressed, each sentence pierced me with a mixture of tenderness and pain. She told me she knew one day she wouldn't be able to explain everything clearly, that there might be confusion, unspoken words, silences I wouldn't understand. But she wanted me to know she saw me, that she knew what I was doing for her, that she recognized the tiredness in my eyes even when I pretended everything was fine, and that even though her mind sometimes took her far away, her heart was always with me. I don't know how many times I read that letter. I clutched it to my chest as if I could hold her once more. I cried so much that my tears stained the paper, but I didn't care, because in those words, I finally found what I had sought for so long. The validation of a daughter who never asked for anything more than a gesture of true love. That discovery gave me the impetus to do something I'd been putting off since the funeral. I opened my social media profile and told my story, not as a complaint or revenge. I told it from the heart. I talked about what it had been like to care for Mom, about the good days and the dark days, about the times I thought I couldn't take it anymore, about the unfair exclusion from her funeral. But above all, I talked about love, about the deep love that needs no applause or acknowledgement, about the love that is given silently with worn hands and sleepless nights. What happened next shocked me. My story was shared by hundreds of people. Strange women wrote to me to tell me they had experienced the same thing, that they had been left out of decisions, that they had been treated like employees instead of daughters, that they too felt the emptiness that ingratitude leaves. Men wrote to me too, sons who had silently cared for their parents, brothers who regretted having left the entire burden on just one person. It was as if my testimony had broken a dam of pent-up pain. A local newspaper contacted me. They wanted to publish an article about the invisible role of family caregivers. I accepted, not out of ego, but because I understood that my story was like many others, that putting words to suffering can help others recognize themselves, heal, not feel so alone. The article came out a week later with the title, "The Daughter Who Cared Until the End and Was Excluded from the Goodbye." The reactions were immediate. Neighbors who had never approached me began talking to me on the street. Some apologized for their indifference, others offered help. But the most shocking thing was receiving a message from a young woman named Laura, who turned out to be the daughter of a friend of my mother's. She told me that her mother had told her about me, that she spoke of my dedication with admiration, that she even kept a photo of me and showed it saying, "This is my Helen. She is my blessing." Each of those gestures was a balm, because for so long I felt I'd been invisible, that everything I did had left no mark. But now I understood that wasn't the case, that true love, even if silent, transcends, that even if injustice screams loudest at first, the truth always finds a way to be seen. One day, while walking through the park, I saw an elderly woman sitting on a bench with a blanket over her legs. I accidentally stopped to look at her. Her daughter was beside her, patiently feeding her. I saw a version of myself in that scene, and I felt a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude, because I had experienced that, because despite the pain, I would do it again, because caring is an act of love that leaves scars, yes, but also leaves traces that dignify. That same night, I lit a candle in front of Mom's portrait. I spoke to her as always. I told her about the letter, about the article, about the people who identified with me. I told her that I now understood many things, that the silence of some doesn't erase the love of others, that a moment of exclusion doesn't undo years of dedication, that the truth has its time, and that even if recognition doesn't come from those we expect, sometimes it comes from unexpected places and with greater force. I began writing letters to other women caregivers, some I met in the groups, others who wrote to me sharing their experiences. I told them they were seen, that they were brave, that even if their stories didn't make the papers, every gesture of love counts. Every sleepless night, every medicine given, every meal prepared, every whisper in the face of pain, all of it builds an invisible but powerful legacy. That's how the idea of creating a small community space was born, a support network for caregivers, A place where we could share not only our sorrows but also our joys. A place where we could laugh at our tiredness, cry without guilt, and recognize ourselves without masks. Because I understood that healing doesn't always come in solitude. Sometimes it's found in the arms of those who have walked similar paths. And in the midst of all that rebirth, one night something happened that completely disarmed me. I was organizing Mom's closet when I found another envelope, this time addressed to the family lawyer. Inside was a copy of her will, a simple document written in her own handwriting. It said that all her belongings, memories, and wishes were in my name, that she trusted me, that she knew I would know what to do with it all. There were no witness signatures or official seals, but there was her handwriting, her intention, her truth. And in that instant, I knew that everything I'd experienced had a deeper meaning than I'd imagined. Because even though I'd been left out of a funeral, no one could leave me out of the most sacred bond that existed between her and me. No one could erase what I'd experienced. No one could rewrite what was authentic. And that certainty was the greatest act of justice I'd ever received in my entire life. When the lawyer summoned me to his office a week after I found the envelope, I didn't know exactly what to expect. I thought he might tell me the letter wasn't legally valid or that someone else had already taken control of everything. But when I arrived, he greeted me with a serene expression and asked me to sit down. On his desk was a beige folder tied with a red ribbon. Very carefully, he opened it and began to read. It was my mother's official will, signed, sealed, and notarized. There was no margin for error or possibility of dispute. Everything she owned, even her bank accounts, was under my responsibility. The silence in that room was dense, not because the moment was tense, but because it was profoundly symbolic. After everything she'd been through, after the scorn, the expulsion from the wake, the humiliation, she had made it clear who she considered her true heir. It wasn't about material possessions. It wasn't about money. It was a way of telling me, I trust you. You are my blood. You are my truth. The lawyer looked at me and said firmly, Your mother made everything very clear. There will be no conflicts. Robert was informed and didn't object. I felt a pang of wonder. My brother agreed to everything without a fight? The same man who denied me entry to the funeral was now simply walking out? The question hung in my mind, but I didn't ask it, because deep down, I no longer needed answers. I had spent a long time seeking justice where there was none. Now I understood that I didn't need his validation. The most important acknowledgement I had already received, and it came from the only person who truly mattered. I left the office clutching the folder to my chest, not because of its contents, but because of what it represented. It was the symbol of a true story, a story of dedication, of pain, of resilience, a story that had been whispered about for years, but now, finally, had a document to back it up. I walked through the streets as if I were floating, not out of joy, but with a kind of melancholic relief, as if the weight I had carried for so long was slowly beginning to dissolve. When I got home, I sat down at the dining room table where we used to have tea. I placed the folder on the polished wood and lit a candle. I closed my eyes and remembered all the times she looked at me silently, as if she knew I didn't need words to say thank you, because that's how she was. Few words, many gestures, and that letter, that will, was the last gesture of a woman who was never one to talk much, but always said the essentials when it was most needed. I decided it was time to close the cycle. I began organizing her belongings with a different perspective, no longer from the perspective of loss, but from the perspective of love. I chose a few items to keep. The wedding ring she always took off before bed, her flower-stained recipe book, a scarf I had knitted for her during a particularly harsh winter. I donated the rest to elderly women in vulnerable situations. I felt that way. She continued to give even after her departure, because that was her legacy, to give without expecting, to love without asking. One afternoon, while tidying her room, I found a small box lined with floral paper. Inside were old photographs, some I'd never seen. There was her as a young woman, smiling with friends in a park. In another, she was holding a baby who wasn't me or Robert. On the back was written in almost childlike handwriting, April 1968. Carla. I stared at that image for a long time. Who was Carla? A cousin, a sister, a daughter. I felt a chill. Maybe there was a part of her story I never knew. Maybe there were secrets she preferred to keep. But I didn't feel anger, only curiosity, because I understood that we all have hidden corners, moments we don't share with anyone. And that's okay. That doesn't make what was shared any less real, what we experienced together. I decided to write her one last letter, not to send it, just to leave a record. In it, I told her everything I couldn't while she was alive. I told her about fear, tiredness, and pent-up rage, but also about deep love, about gratitude, about the days we spent in silence watching television, about the times she stroked my hair without saying a word. I told her that although there were times when I felt alone, I now understood that she was always there, in the only way she knew how. That night, I slept with the letter under my pillow. I had a strange dream. We were in a bright kitchen, baking a cake together. She was laughing, making mistakes with the ingredients, looking at me and saying, "That's not how it was, Helen, but it doesn't matter. It's still delicious." I woke up with tears in my eyes, but also with a smile, because it was the first time in a long time that I dreamed of her without pain, without goodbyes, just sharing a simple, happy moment. I decided to plant a tree in the yard, a lemon tree, her favorite. Every day I water it carefully. I kneel beside the earth and talk to her. I tell her how my life is going, the new projects, the letters I continue to receive from women caregivers, the testimonies we share at gatherings. It's like having a conversation with her, through the roots, the wind, the life that goes on, because I understood that love never ends. It only transforms. One Sunday, I received an unexpected message. It was from Robert. He asked to talk. I hesitated a lot, not out of hatred, but out of protection. But I agreed. We met at a discreet cafe. He had changed, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes. He apologized. He said he'd acted out of fear, that he didn't know how to deal with Mom's death, and that he'd poured it all on me, that he blamed me because deep down he knew he wasn't there, that he didn't want to be there. I listened to him in silence. I didn't say much, because sometimes forgiveness doesn't require grand speeches, just the decision to no longer carry what isn't ours. When we said goodbye, she told me something that has stuck with me, Helen. She always chose you, and I knew it from the beginning. It hurt, but now I understand. I left that cafe with a heavy but light heart, because it wasn't about winning. It was never a competition. It was about honoring, and I honored her with every ounce of my being. At that moment, I knew I was ready to close that stage, not to forget, but to move on, to live, to allow myself new stories, because I had spent so much time revolving around pain that I had forgotten that I too deserved joy, that I too deserved to be cared for, that I too had the right to live a full life. And all of it, that whole awakening, began with a woman who wrote a letter 6 years before she died, thinking of her daughter, thinking of me. In the days following my encounter with Robert, something inside me began to fall into place, not like a piece that fits perfectly, but like a broken object that, when accepted as it is, finds new beauty in its cracks. I understood that the pain I had experienced was not an exception, but part of a deeper fabric that many women silently share. And instead of wanting to forget it, I decided to honor it. I reclaimed my garden. I planted lavender again, like Mom did in the spring. I painted the patio fence a soft blue, the kind she always said reminded her of the clear sky after a storm. I took her crocheted throws out of the closet and placed them on the armchairs. I filled the house with her scent, her essence, not to remain trapped in the past, but to integrate it into my present with dignity. One day, I sat down with a blank notebook and wrote on the first page, "This is the story of a daughter who cared for me until her last breath, and who also deserved to be cared for." And I began to narrate in detail every step of this journey. From the first time I noticed something wasn't right with Mom, to that unexpected letter that gave me the certainty of having been deeply loved. It wasn't a diary. It was an act of memory, an act of resistance, an act of love, because writing it allowed me to give form to a pain that had long been a lump in my chest, and because I knew that by doing so, other women could read themselves in my words. They could feel less alone, stronger, more seen. I began receiving invitations to speak at small caregiver gatherings, in community centers, parishes, and neighborhood libraries. They asked me to tell my story, to share how one survives family abandonment, how one rebuilds life when everything revolves around the other. And I spoke. My voice trembled at first, but with a growing confidence born not of anger, but of compassion. I saw tears in the eyes of older women who came to hug me. I heard raw, real stories, like my own. Some weren't able to say goodbye to their parents. Others were thrown out of hospitals. Many lost their health due to tireless caregiving. And in each story, I saw a part of myself reflected. Because pain, when shared with respect, doesn't divide. It unites. I also decided to start a small social media channel. I called it Herencia de Amor, Heritage of Love. On it, I began to share fragments of my story, stories other women shared with me, without sensationalism, without forced drama, just with truth, with emotion, with that closeness that grows between those who have experienced something similar. One afternoon, I received a message from a 19-year-old girl. She told me that her mother took care of her grandmother, and that she often felt frustrated because she didn't understand the emotional strain it entailed. She thanked me for opening her eyes. She told me that she could now see her mother with a different perspective, a more compassionate, more loving one. I cried, because I knew in that moment that it had all been worth it. Every sleepless night, every tear, every injustice, everything. Sometimes when evening falls, I go out to the garden, sit under the lemon tree I planted, and close my eyes. I listen to the wind, the birds, the distant sounds of the city, and I feel Mom is near. Not like a ghostly apparition, not like a blurry memory, but like a warm presence that inhabits the way I love, the way I speak, the way I hold others. Because that's what she taught me, even without words, to hold from the soul. And if I share all this with you on the other side of the screen today, it's because I deeply believe that these stories shouldn't remain locked away within four walls. They deserve to be told. They deserve to be heard. Because perhaps, in the midst of your own grief, you'll find a little solace here, a little light, a little bit of you. If you too have cared for someone and felt invisible, I want you to know that I see you, that your dedication matters, that your story deserves to be told, and that you are not alone. This channel is your home. It's our refuge, a space where every testimony is sacred, where every sigh echoes, where every tear finds an embrace. Thank you for joining me this far. Thank you for opening your heart, for taking this time, for making my story a little bit yours too. If this story touched your soul, I invite you to subscribe. Not for me, but for all those women who have yet to share theirs. Every subscription, every comment, every share is a seed of memory we plant together. And if you want to continue hearing true stories of overcoming difficulties, of silent love, of wounds that transform into strength, the next video is already on the screen. Click and join me, because the healing journey is just beginning. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. See you in the next story.